Okay, so the parathyroid gland, that's on page 608, that is a group of really 4 glands which are posterior on the thyroid gland and to the side of it that you see there in that diagram. So 2 pairs embedded in the posterior surface. And they contain 2 cell types that are very important for the hormone production. The oxyphil cells, no real known function, and then the parathyroid, or the principal cells, which are the important hormone producing cells. So the parathyroid principal cells produce parathyroid hormone, or PTH, and these increase the calcium levels in the extracellular fluid. Now, what was the hormone produced by the thyroid gland that does the opposite? I just mentioned it. Calcitonin. We'll come back to that later, talk about how they work together. In this case, the parathyroid hormone increases calcium levels in your extracellular fluid. Okay, so these cells, the principal cells, monitor the calcium levels that are in your blood. So if your calcium levels fall below certain normal levels, parathyroid hormone is released, and that does cause an increase in your calcium levels. So you would have seen these in the laboratory when you look at these in the microscope. And you would have seen them in the same slide that had the thyroid gland on it, because it's right on top of it, superficial group of cells, and they're really tight packed, dense cells to the side. Okay, so as I said, PTH and calcitonin have opposing effects. For a healthy adult, the PTH along with another chemical, calcitriol, are the main regulators for the circulating calcium. And oddly enough, removing the thyroid gland has no major effect on calcium. And one reason why is because we generally get enough calcium in our diets. But for some people, they do have to take increased calcium, especially if you have something like osteopenia or osteoporosis. You take that in addition to vitamin D3 to help with the absorption. But calcitonin can be administered clinically in certain metabolic disorders where you have excessive calcium and excessive bone formation. Okay, so this shows the homeostatic mechanism. If we have increasing levels of blood calcium levels, the C cells are the receptors, and they note that there's this increase in calcium. They will secrete calcitonin, which has an effect at the kidneys and the digestive tract. They respond by increasing excretion of the calcium at the kidneys. And the calcium absorption from the digestive tract is then prevented. So both your kidneys and your digestive tract respond to calcitonin. And your blood calcium levels go down. Oppositely, if your calcium levels are declining, the principal cells in your parathyroid gland, I gave you the receptors, know this, and they secrete parathyroid hormone. The effectors are your kidneys, your bones, and your digestive tract. And the response, you have increased reabsorption of calcium by your kidneys. You actually have calcium released from your bones. What it does, it actually causes your osteoclasts to break down your bone material to release calcium. And you have increased calcitriol production by your kidneys that causes more calcium absorption by your digestive tract. So 3 different things happen to increase your calcium levels. And indeed, they do go back up as a result of those homeostatic mechanisms. Okay, so understand that. Okay, and this table just basically reiterates what we just talked about, although it goes into a little bit more detail about the osteoblasts and osteoclasts. It says the parathyroid hormone stimulates your osteoblasts to secrete growth factor also. And the osteoclasts don't have parathyroid hormone receptors. But the growth factor results in increase in osteoclasts and their activity. And as you have more osteoclasts, you have more mineral turnover because it's breaking them down and therefore more calcium release. That parathyroid, let me try it again, parathyroid hormone enhances reabsorption of your calcium by your kidneys, as we mentioned, and so you don't lose as much in urine. And parathyroid hormone stimulates formation and secretion of calcitriol by the kidneys, and that enhances the effects of parathyroid hormone. But the calcitriol also being produced by the kidneys enhances calcium and phosphate absorption by your digestive tract. Okay, so parathyroid hormone, does it increase or decrease calcium levels in your blood? Increase. Okay, increase. And which one decreases? Calcitonin. Let's talk about the adrenal gland now. So it sits right on top of the kidneys, and you would have seen this in the laboratory as well. We call this the suprarenal gland as well. It is also considered retroperitoneal, like the kidneys, because it is behind the peritoneal cavity, or the peritoneum. And only the front surface or anterior surface is covered with parietal peritoneum, or that membrane, serous membrane. Has a lot of blood vessels. If we look at the adrenal gland layers, we have an adrenal capsule, which is the outer connective tissue, very thin. And as we move in, we have an outer region of adrenal cortex that's yellowish. That's because of the lipids that are in that layer, and especially cholesterol and some fatty acids. And it produces more than 24 steroid hormones, and we just refer to them as corticosteroids. They all affect your metabolism. They're important for maintaining life. And then the most inner region is called the inner adrenal medulla. And here's where you produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now you'll see these two terms used with some of the other organs too, cortex and medulla. It's just kind of general terms. Cortex is usually outer, medulla is usually inner. If we look at a cross section of the adrenal gland in much more detail, and we move into the cortex and divide it up, the most outer layer of that cortex is the zona glomerulosa. It secretes mineral corticoids, and aldosterone is the one we talk about the most. Aldosterone. It increases renal reabsorption of sodium and water. And especially we see this if antidiuretic hormone is being produced. So if we're producing ADH, you're also going to be seeing aldosterone. And that accelerates your renal loss or the kidney loss of potassium. So the release is going to be stimulated by the decreasing blood pressure and volume through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We'll talk more about that. And it's inhibited by the hormones that oppose that system. So as you can imagine, if you have decreased blood pressure, then your body is going to want to reabsorb more water. And one way it does it is by not losing as much sodium. So you retain more sodium, so you retain more water. And that increases your blood pressure. We'll come back to that. Okay, moving down in the cortex, we have the zona fasciculata, central portion of the adrenal cortex. It secretes glucocorticoids. and the two we talk about mainly are cortisol and corticosteroid. The liver converts some of that cortisol to cortisone. And secretion of these are stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary gland. Some of the actions of the glucocorticoids, well, they affect glucose metabolism. They increase the rate of the liver glucose and glycogen formation so that we store them. It stimulates the release of amino acids from your skeletal muscles. Stimulates the release of lipids from adipose tissue. And it promotes lipid catabolism. They supplement what we call the glucose-sparing effects of growth hormone. In addition, the cortisol being produced has an anti-inflammatory effect. Now, like some of the other hormones in this region, the secretion is going to be stimulated by ACTH also. Moving down in the cortex to the zona reticularis. It's a narrow band that borders the adrenal medulla. Here we secrete small quantities of androgens. Again, this is stimulated by ACTH. And we can convert to estrogens in the bloodstream. For the most part, not a lot of effects in the normal adult, but it does stimulate the development of pubic hair in males and females before puberty. So that's your androgens. Still in the adrenal glands, keep in mind. Now we'll move deep into the adrenal medulla. It secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're the fight or flight response hormones. So increased cardiac activity, increased blood pressure, increased glycogen breakdown and blood glucose. And you can understand why you would want these things to occur if your body's needing to ramp up to do something physical. Because all these things are going to make your body more efficient. It's going to send more oxygen to the areas it needs, more nutrients, more energy. And this is being secreted in response to the sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Again, remember, sympathetic, parasympathetic are kind of opposites when it comes to nervous system. Okay, we're going to move into the pancreas. The pancreas is mostly retroperitoneal, so behind the peritoneum. It lies in the loop formed between the inferior border of the stomach and the proximal portion of the small intestine. So in our models, often you'll see it connected to either the stomach or the beginning part of the small intestine in the models. Very slender and pale, lumpy. And there's two regions of importance, the exocrine pancreas and the endocrine. The exocrine pancreas, that is most of your volume, and you have clusters of cells called pancreatic acini, and they have attached ducts. They secrete an alkaline enzyme-rich fluid, and the fluid flows to the intestinal tract through the pancreatic ducts. And then on the other hand, the endocrine pancreas, that's only 1%, still very important. A small group of hormone-producing cells are scattered in clusters, and we call those pancreatic islets, or islets of Langerhans. And you would have seen those in the laboratory in the slides as well. It's about 2 million of the islets in a pancreas. Now within the islet, we have alpha cells, and an important hormone that they produce, glucagon. They raise your blood glucose, so they increase the rate of glycogen breakdown and glucose release by the liver. Again, this is going to be needed when you need energy. The beta cells, they're the ones that produce insulin. So they lower your blood glucose. They make cells take up glucose. And they increase glycogen production in the liver and the skeletal muscles. And remember, glycogen is the way we store glucose. So it's having an opposite effect of which hormone? Insulin has opposite effect of? Glucagon. Okay. Delta cells, they produce a peptide hormone that's identical to growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So they suppress the release of glucagon and insulin. And they slow the rate of food absorption and enzyme secretion in the intestinal tract. Pancreatic polypeptide cells produce pancreatic polypeptide that inhibits gallbladder contraction. It regulates production of some of the pancreatic enzymes. It helps control the rate of nutrient absorption. What's the gallbladder mostly known for, by the way? What is secreted there? And what's released there? And it stores this material. It's a greenish material. Bile. Yeah, bile. Now, bile is actually produced by wet organ, though, not produced by the gallbladder. Gallbladder just stores it. Right now? It's right side of it. It's a large organ right there in front of it.
Stomach.
The liver. The liver. That's okay. So the liver is actually what produces it.
It was liver.
Okay. Insulin and glucagon are the primary hormones that control blood glucose levels, so they have opposing effects. So as blood glucose rises, the beta cells are going to secrete insulin, which stimulates the transport of glucose into the target cells. So that also increases the rate of glucose use and ATP generation, increases conversion of glucose to glycogen, increases amino acid absorption and protein synthesis. It increases the triglyceride synthesis in adipose tissue. And see, that overall will then decrease your blood glucose levels. On the other hand, as your blood glucose declines, then your alpha cells are going to secrete glucagon. And they stimulate glycogen breakdown to release glucose. So your alpha cells, again, are in the pancreatic islets. They secrete glucagon. The liver and the skeletal muscle and the adipose tissue are the effectors, and they respond by increasing the breakdown of glycogen to glucose in the liver and the muscle cells. They increase the breakdown of fatty acids in the adipose tissue. They increase synthesis and release of glucose in the liver. And overall, that's going to increase your blood glucose levels. I'll show this quick video.
The sugary snack you devour enters your digestive system and is broken down to simple sugars like glucose. Glucose enters the bloodstream, causing an increase in blood glucose levels. But various mechanisms bring blood glucose back down to its normal level, the set point. This is an example of homeostasis, the body's tendency to maintain relatively constant internal conditions. Hormones produced by the pancreas regulate blood glucose levels. Let's zoom in. When blood glucose levels are high, glucose molecules leave the blood and enter beta cells in the pancreas. The beta cells respond by releasing the hormone insulin. Insulin enters the bloodstream and is transported to cells all over the body. Let's see what happens in the liver. Insulin binds to receptors on liver cells. This causes the cells to take in more glucose. Inside the liver cells, glucose is converted to glycogen, a storage molecule. Blood glucose levels decrease as glucose is taken up by liver cells and other body cells. As a result, less and less insulin is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. This is an example of how negative feedback maintains homeostasis. What happens if you've skipped lunch and your blood glucose levels are low? Let's zoom into the pancreas again. When blood glucose levels are low, alpha cells in the pancreas release the hormone glucagon. Glucagon enters the bloodstream and acts on target cells in the liver. Glucagon binds to receptors on the liver cells, signaling the liver cells to break glycogen down to glucose. Glucose is released, and blood glucose levels increase. As a result, less glucagon is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. In this way, two hormones with opposing effects allow the body to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In diabetes, the body is unable to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In type 1 diabetes, the beta cells of the pancreas are destroyed by the immune system, and so no insulin is produced. In type 2 diabetes, the pancreas produces insulin, but target cells do not take up glucose. In both types of diabetes, when blood glucose levels rise, cells do not take up the additional glucose, and so blood glucose remains. This example shows the importance of homeostasis in everyone's life.
Okay, so there's a couple of forms of diabetes, and one you're really born with, and the other you can actually acquire it over time. So in one, your body basically has, in type 1, the beta cells have been destroyed. And what's the importance of beta cells?
To bring the glucose level back down.
Right, by doing what? What do beta cells do? They produce
Glucagon? No.
insulin. Yeah. So the beta cells are what produce the insulin. So if those are destroyed, you can't produce insulin, which then lowers your blood glucose levels, right? And so that's one reason why someone with type 1 is going to have to get insulin injections. Okay, what happens in type 2?
If the body can't absorb
Can't absorb
the glucose.
why?
Because I can't remember what they're called, is the beta cells.
Well, in this case, what's happening is receptors of your cells don't respond anymore to insulin. Okay, and one of the reasons why is because as you, in a lot of cases, as you take in lots and lots of sugars and carbohydrates over time, for some reason you become just kind of sensitized to it or tolerant, and therefore the cells just don't respond anymore because it's like constant intake of, say, glucose, and the cell just will not respond anymore to insulin to take up more glucose. So that can be a real big issue, of course, and that's what the majority of diabetes is. Okay, the pineal gland. We were looking for this in the models in the laboratory. It was kind of funny because I never really looked really hard for them in the models, but because it really is a really small gland anyway. And usually the pituitary gland is pretty noticeable in these models, But the other one is right at the posterior of the brain, right above the brain stem, very small segment, part of what we call the epithalamus. And it has neurons, neuroglia, and secretory cells called pinealocytes. They produce melatonin. And of course, when you hear that term, you probably automatically think, what? Sleep. So collaterals from the visual pathway go into the pineal gland. They affect the rate of the melatonin production. The rate's lowest during the daylight and highest at night, where it ought to be. So what melatonin does is set your circadian rhythms. It inhibits reproductive functions also, protects against damage by free radicals. Free radicals are like unpaired electrons, and they're things that oxidize your cells. Now, what's something that people often do to try to kind of reset their clock or get it to work right? Because these things that produce the melatonin are stimulated by what? These cells. What did it say? What do you think? What affects your sleep patterns? What's the stimulus?
Eating.
Because we say it increases at night, so eating can definitely affect it, but what's something else that affects when you get tired? Just naturally. Sorry?
Over there.
What outside? You know,
Sunlight.
Daylight.
Okay. Sorry, I probably wasn't asking the question quite
That
right.
was too obvious.
But sunlight, okay. The sunlight's what is actually a stimulus for this, and some people will actually to try to reset themselves right will actually, especially in the winter time, since there's not that much sunlight, will actually get certain types of lights at their house that release the wavelengths that come from sunlight. Because some people's bodies just don't react maybe the way they're supposed to, or don't intercept enough sunlight, or we just don't get outside enough in the winter time, right? And you end up getting, it's called SAD. What does that stand for? Seasonal affective disorder. So sometimes, and all these things are tied in together.
They made a clock now that actually will produce sunlight.
Right. It gets brighter in the morning, especially if you have to get up in the dark. Okay, diabetes mellitus, let's talk a little bit about that. This is in the clinical module. Characterized by glucose concentrations high enough to overwhelm your kidney reabsorption. So hyperglycemia is presence of abnormally high blood glucose. Glucosuria is glucose in your urine. Polyuria is excessive urine production. So it can be caused by genetic abnormalities or mutations. So you could have inadequate insulin production, or synthesis of abnormal insulin molecules, or production of defective insulin receptors. Type 1, in this case, you have the inadequate insulin production by your pancreatic beta cells, as I've already said. So you have to receive insulin daily through injection or some kind of infusion. But only 5 to 10% of cases. This is often going to develop in children or young adults. Type 2 is the most common. You produce enough insulin, it's just that your tissues don't respond to it. And we will treat with diet and exercise and certain medications. About 25.8 million people in the U.S. have some form of diabetes mellitus. If it's untreated, it can cause a lot of problems. If you don't have insulin, cells can't absorb glucose from the surrounding. You have to have glucose for your cells to operate normally, right? And tissues respond as if they're in a chronic starvation state. You break down lipids and proteins as the alternate energy source. So your body starts breaking down, cause abnormal changes in blood vessel structure. Diabetic retinopathy can occur where you have partial or complete blindness because the capillaries in your retina get damaged. You have increased risk of heart attack. And diabetic nephropathy, you have degenerative changes in your kidneys that can lead to kidney failure. It's like a very serious thing, obviously. And that's caused by abnormal blood flow to the neural tissue. I'm sorry, let me try that again. In diabetic neuropathy, you have abnormal blood flow to neural tissue. The peripheral tissue damage in the distal limbs occurs. As a result, your blood flow is reduced. You can get tissue death, ulceration, and infection, and in your feet, you can get loss of toes or portions of one or both feet. You've probably heard of that happening in extreme situations. My wife's always getting after me for eating way too much sugar. She's always saying, "You're going to lose a leg or an arm one of these days, and you're going to be sorry for that." I try to reduce my sugar as much as I can, but I just love sugar. I grew up on it. It was like one of our food groups, you know. In addition to vegetables, proteins, and there was the sugar group. Probably why half my teeth have fillings in them now. Plus, we didn't have fluoride in our water. Okay. Well, let's talk about integrations of these systems and hormones. There's 4 types of hormone interactions. Cells have more than one type of hormone receptor, so they can respond to a lot of different hormones at the same time. So you can receive instructions from 2 hormones at the same time and have 4 possible outcomes: antagonistic, additive, permissive, or integrative. So antagonistic, this means opposing effects. And so basically, it's a balancing act, and one hormone is going to win out over the other. The observed effects will be weaker than produced by either hormone unopposed because they are fighting each other. So good examples, as we've already talked about, parathyroid hormone versus calcitonin, or insulin versus glucagon, because they do act very opposite of each other. Additive effects, the net result is greater than each acting alone. If the result is actually greater than just the simple additive, then it's called synergistic. So examples, glucose-sparing actions of growth hormone being enhanced by the presence of glucocorticoids. Permissive effects, one hormone is needed for the second hormone to produce its effects. Example, epinephrine changes the rate of cellular energy consumption only if you have thyroid hormone around. Integrative effects, the hormones produce different but complementary effects. This is important in coordinating the activities of your different physiological systems. Example here, the effects of calcitriol and parathyroid hormone on the tissues and calcium metabolism. Okay, how is synergistic different than additive? See if you remember that. Additive is pretty simple, right? 1 plus 1 equals 2. So the two things together have the effect of a simple summation. Synergistic is more like 1 plus 1 equals 3. Does that make sense? Not mathematically. So it's greater than the simple sum. So let's look at some really specific integration. So blood pressure and volume homeostatic regulation. So your long-term regulation of blood pressure and volume is going to involve pituitary gland, the adrenal gland, and the endocrine cells in the heart and the kidneys. So all these are working together. So let's look at what happens. If we want to decrease blood pressure, the endocrine cells in the heart walls will respond to overstretching. So it's really a simple receptor here. You have high blood pressure and your body knows it because you're stretching the walls of the heart. Therefore, natriuretic peptide is released, and that's being released by the heart. It promotes sodium and water loss at the kidneys. So one way to lower your blood pressure is to get rid of a lot more water. And one way to get rid of a lot more water is to get rid of a lot more sodium so your body doesn't retain the water. And you inhibit the release of renin, an antidiuretic hormone, and aldosterone. This also suppresses your thirst, so you don't want to drink more water. And therefore the overall effect, lower blood volume, lower pressure. All works together. Okay, and all of that is shown right here in this diagram. Now, one extra thing shown on here as a result of the natriuretic peptide released by the heart is also your blood vessels will dilate. So they get larger and therefore not as much pressure. You know how if you want to increase pressure, say on the hose pipe, you restrict the end of it to make it squirt. So in this case, you're doing the opposite. Okay, let's look at the opposite. To increase blood pressure and volume, the endocrine cells in the kidneys will release erythropoietin, which increases the amount of red blood cells being produced. This is in the kidneys. Leads to increased blood volume. Renin activates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or we just call it the RAS, which increases fluid intake and fluid retention. Again, that's going to increase your blood pressure. Okay, so all these things together will help in increasing the blood pressure. Now, one thing we haven't talked a lot about is when renin is released, it causes angiotensinogen to be released, which is causing angiotensin 1 to be converted to 2 in a process of chemical change, which is what causes aldosterone to be secreted and ADH to be secreted, and it stimulates you to be thirsty. And therefore you're going to drink a lot more fluid, and in the end you have more fluid intake and you have retention of the liquids, and therefore your blood pressure goes up. Okay? Let's talk about homeostatic regulation of growth. Here we have cooperation of a lot of endocrine organs also. And hormones are involved, in this case, are regulated very independently. The mixture of the hormones will affect the metabolic operations. The combined effects produce very unique growth patterns in each person. But the circulating levels of the hormones are still regulated pretty independently. So these are the hormones that are regulating growth. Insulin allows passage of glucose and amino acids across the plasma membrane into a growing cell. If you're not getting enough insulin into those cells, they will not grow. That's the energy, that's the food source. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are involved. In this case, parathyroid hormone and calcitriol that's released as a result promotes absorption of calcium salts for bone deposition, so your bones get thicker and grow. For proper mineralization, okay. Thyroid hormones are required for proper nervous system and skeletal system development. And your reproductive hormones do lots of things. They affect your osteoblast activity to build bone. They stimulate target cell growth and differentiation. In males, you have androgens. In females, estrogens have different types of effects. They produce differential growth that results in sex-related differences, proportional differences, secondary sex characteristics. Growth hormone in children, this helps in supporting protein synthesis, which you need for building muscle and structure and cellular growth. In adults, you still need some growth hormone. It assists in energy metabolism and storage. Like specifically in adults, the growth hormone maintains normal blood glucose concentrations, mobilizes lipid reserves that are stored. So do remember that system of integration with blood pressure. You're going to see a few questions about that on the exam. Let's talk about how hormones are involved with stress, because all of us have some impact from stress. So stress is any physical or emotional condition that threatens this balance or this homeostasis. And it's mediated by a lot of adjustments. I mean, even, sometimes we're just talking about physical stress like being cold. And you shiver as a response to a drop in body temperature. Okay, but we'll also talk about mental, emotional stress also has impact. But there's a lot of stress-causing factors that are going to cause physiological responses. So you have a stress response or general adaptation syndrome. So here's the kind of stages that a person goes through in stress response. And this isn't just like emotional, this is physical also. So you have an alarm phase, which is the immediate sympathetic response to the stress. And actually in our own lawn class, in that lab, students actually do this test where they put their hands in cold water and they monitor certain physiological responses of their body. And indeed, the fight or flight response hormones get involved even in that situation because the body sees that as a stress. Even when you get up from a sitting position to standing, it's still a stressful situation and you go through these same phases. So alarm phase, again, immediate sympathetic response. Epinephrine is the dominant hormone. You have two main responses. Energy reserves are mobilized, mainly glucose. The general fight or flight responses occur. Then you go into resistance phase. That happens after a few hours of stress. The glucocorticoids are the dominant hormones. So here we have epinephrine, growth hormone, thyroid hormone. You have continued high energy demands. The glycogen reserves are exhausted. The body shifts to utilizing lipids and amino acids eventually. An overall effect, mobilization of the body's energy reserves, and while it's reserving glucose for the neural tissue, because your nervous system can only operate on glucose. So it's kind of reserve that for that specific function. Then you go into the exhaustion phase. This happens when the energy reserves cannot be maintained. The resistance phase ends. It can be a period of weeks or months. The homeostatic regulation breaks down. Organ systems begin to fail. You have imbalances in minerals and electrolytes. Okay. Let's see if I want to go over some extra detail. Yeah, and this shows in the alarm phase. So the epinephrine and norepinephrine being released by the adrenal medulla causes increased mental alertness, increased energy use, mobilization of glycogen, lipid reserves, circulation changes, reduction in digestive activity and urine production, increased sweat gland secretion, increased heart rate and respiratory rate. By the way, this is one of the reasons why if you're under a certain amount of stress, even emotional stress, you start having GI tract problems. A person can have like irritable bowel syndrome, things like that. Under the resistance phase, you're mobilizing remaining energy reserves. You're conserving glucose again. You're conserving salts, water, loss of potassium and hydrogen ions. So your body may actually go into this phase where you retain more water. And then again, finally, if you get into the exhaustion stage, a lot of bad things could happen. Hopefully it doesn't get to that level. But indeed, even with emotional stress, you've probably heard of psychosomatic disorder. So emotional stress can actually lead to physiological disorders, can have a real physical impact down the road. So finally, let's talk about some endocrine disorders. A lot of different abnormalities can occur that cause endocrine disorders. It can happen at the endocrine gland. It can be involved with mechanisms that involve the endocrine and neural control. It can happen at the target tissues. And usually we're talking about either underproduction, which is hyposecretion, or overproduction, hypersecretion of the hormones. Most common disorder, though, is hyposecretion. So in some cases with hyposecretion, you have metabolic factors that are involved. You have a deficiency in certain substances that are needed to synthesize the hormone, like in hypothyroidism. Maybe you don't get enough iodine. There's a lot of other reasons also. Physical damage, interruption to the normal circulatory supply, damage to the endocrine cell or the target cell can occur. Then there can be congenital disorders. You don't produce normal amounts of the hormone. This can be caused by the gland being too small, the enzyme is abnormal that's involved, the receptors are insensitive, the gland cells don't have receptors to even become stimulated. Can also be caused by the presence of abnormal receptors in the target tissue, so they just don't respond. Your glands and regulatory mechanisms may be normal, but again, the peripheral cells that are supposed to respond aren't going to respond to the circulating hormone. And a real good example we've already talked about, type 2 diabetes. Peripheral cells do not respond to the insulin. Okay, here's some specific examples. Acromegaly results from overproduction of growth hormone. It causes fusion of the epiphyseal plates. Let me try this again. Oh, I'm sorry. It occurs after the epiphyseal plates have fused, which means you still have more production of the connective tissues and materials around it. I was reading that incorrectly without thinking. But the problem is you don't have any more increase in height, you just get more thickness. So the bone shape changes. Cartilaginous areas of the skeleton start enlarging. You get very broad facial features, enlarged lower jaws. There was a particular fellow, I'm pretty sure the fellow that played in years ago, Goldfinger, probably had this. There's been some other famous actors that were used because they had this particular feature. Thyroid disorders like goiter, this is an enlarged thyroid gland, will happen if you have thyroid hyposecretion involved with iodine deficiency. In infantile hypothyroidism, this is congenital. It's a thyroid hormone deficiency. Individuals with this will have a mental disability, puffy faces, and thick tongues. And Addison's disease, caused by hyposecretion of corticosteroids like glucocorticoids. And you have pigment changes in the skin, because of stimulation of melanocytes, because of ACTH, because it is similar to the melatonin stimulating hormone. In Cushing's disease, you have hypersecretion of glucocorticoids. In this case, the lipid reserves are mobilized and the adipose tissue accumulates, especially in the cheeks and the base of the neck. Okay, this chart goes over a few other types of disorders. Talk about gigantism and acromegaly, which we already discussed, because of pituitary growth failure. They talk about diabetes insipidus there, related to ADH, because you have inappropriate ADH secretion. In the case of hyperthyroidism or Graves' disease, the problem is hypothyroidism or infantile hypothyroidism. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading that chart wrong also. That they're giving you actually what happens with each of those hormones in terms of underproduction and overproduction. I apologize. Let me look at that again. So results of underproduction of growth hormone, pituitary growth failure, for overproduction, gigantism and acromegaly, for underproduction of ADH, diabetes insipidus, overproduction, inappropriate ADH secretion, for underproduction of thyroxine and triiodothyronine, or T3 and T4, hypothyroidism, infantile hypothyroidism, myxedema. If you have overproduction of T3, T4, that's the hyperthyroidism and Graves' disease. And for PTH, results of underproduction, hypoparathyroidism, and overproduction is hyperparathyroidism, and you can see there the different effects those have. This chart shows you the underproduction effects of insulin, mineralocorticoids, as well as glucocorticoids. We'd already talked about a couple of those, like Addison's disease or Cushing's disease in the case of the glucocorticoids. There are also disorders related to underproduction and overproduction of epinephrine and norepinephrine. But the same, there are problems with estrogen and androgens in terms of overproduction and underproduction as well. In the case of females with estrogens, if you have an underproduction of estrogen, you can have sterility and lack of secondary sex characteristics. With males, you can have adrenogenital syndrome or precocious puberty, premature sexual maturation. With the androgens in males, you can have hypogonadism, which leads to sterility and lack of secondary sex characteristics, or in overproduction, adrenogenital syndrome or precocious puberty also.